on a calm Thursday night, one of those few times when everything felt. The place was a bit too quiet. The faint hum is still the sole sound. Of the kitchen's dishwasher in operation I was folding while seated on the couch. Laundry in an attempt to keep myself busy while awaiting my spouse's return from Matt. My son had just returned from his recent part-time employment. Began working in the evenings to accumulate funds for his forthcoming 22-year-old college semester. He was now a self-assured young guy, remarkably similar to his father in many aspects, although apart from others, his presences constantly gave the house a boost of energy, and today exactly the same. "Hey, Mom, you're doing fine." As he entered the living room, he inquired. His keys were thrown onto the coffee table, and I grinned. "Just wrapping up here, you." I was so hungry that I considered making dinner. He shrugged shortly after, so I suppose I could eat. "Dad is coming home shortly," and I froze. "Yes, he will be stilling over the washing." "I'll be home in about an hour," I said. Too rapidly something regarding how I must have gotten Matt's attention. He glanced at me with interest, his brow scowling a little as though reading I looked aside from my thoughts, feigning to pay attention to the clothing in front of me. He inquired in a casual tone, "Is everything okay?" However, with a hint of worry, I compelled a smile. "Of course, dear, why would be?" But even as I was saying it, I might sense the burden of the unsaid. The thoughts that linger between us. Something was beyond my comprehension. Anything I wasn't even interested in admit that Matt took a seat on the edge of the couch was closer than I had anticipated. Presence was somewhat consoling, yet there was a tightness that was also uncomfortable. Was unable to ignore a subtle pressure growing with every second. While we sat there, I couldn't help but think regarding Matt's growth, and it felt like time had gone by so swiftly. He used to be a boy jogging just yesterday. Throughout the home, full of inquiries and energy, but he was now a self-assured guy. Confident and progressively aloof from the boy I brought up. "Are you certain?" He repeated his question. "Everything's okay, Mom." This time my voice is softer and more worried. Looked up, making eye contact with him there. Something in his eyes caused my heart skip a beat, perhaps with a gentleness, or was there something else I was unable to determine? And that frightened me. I didn't say anything. Suddenly getting up and attempting to shake off the odd sensation that had taken hold, I'll start preparing dinner over me, but I couldn't help but notice as I left his gaze had lingered on mine, and I couldn't get rid of the sensation that between us something had changed, something that neither of us possessed acknowledged. Yet in the kitchen, I tried to focus on cooking, hoping the normalcy of the routine would calm me down. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until my husband would walk through the door. It was strange, but I found myself wishing he wouldn't. I didn't know why, but a part of me wanted to hold on to this quiet moment with Matt. Just a little longer, he wandered into the kitchen a few minutes later, leaning against the counter as I stirred the sauce on the stove. He was watching me, but not in the usual way. There was an intensity in his gaze that made my heart race need any help. He asked, his voice low, almost tentative. I shook my head quickly. "No, I've got it, thanks." But even as I said it, I could feel the tension building again, thickening the air between us. I didn't know what to do with it. Didn't know how to make sense of the feelings that were stirring inside me. I was his mother, and yet I glanced at the clock again, my stomach tightening. My husband would be home soon. "Matt, could you, before I could finish?" He stepped closer, too close. His hand brushed against mine as he reached for the spoon I was holding, and suddenly the room felt too small. Too quiet. Too charged with something I didn't want to name. A spark shot through me at the touch, and I pulled my hand away quickly, startled by the intensity of it. "Mom," his voice was soft. Concerned. "Are you okay?" I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling, didn't even understand. "Stand it myself. I'm fine," I said, my voice shakier than I intended. Just tired, that's all, but I knew it was more than that. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. The air was thick with unspoken thoughts, unacknowledged feelings, and the weight of it all was suffocating. I turned back to the stove, desperate to focus on anything but the growing tension between us. My husband would be home soon. Everything would go back to normal then. Right? But deep down, I knew that nothing was normal anymore. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. Matt and I sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence. Between us, louder than it should have been, I tried to focus on the clinking of forks, the soft hum of the refrigerator. Anything to distract me from the tension I could feel. Building with every passing minute, I glanced at the clock. My husband should have been home by now, but there was no sign of him. It was getting late, and the hush between Matt and myself was becoming intolerable. "So you talked to Dad today?" Matt asked, breaking the silence. His voice sounded nonchalant, but there was something underneath it. Something that made my heart jump a beat. I nodded, not trusting me to speak, terrified of what might slip out if I did. He claimed he'd be home by 8. 8, I said. Finally, my voice sounding more normal than I felt. But you know how work gets probably stuck in traffic. Matt sat back in his chair observing me for a moment. His eyes never left mine, and I could feel the weight of his gaze. It was uncomfortable the way he regarded me, as though he was attempting to discover something I wasn't prepared to. He inquired again, "Cher, Mom, are you okay?" For the 100th time, it seemed, I forced a smile that night, trembling my head a little, but "I'm actually fine, Matt." In actuality, I wasn't okay. I hadn't been all right ever before I became aware of the way his gaze rested on me for a bit too long. There was something that neither of us desired. Admit, but we both sensed the my phone's vibrating sound on the it relieved my stress, and I leaped to my feet. Thankful for the diversion, which was my husband's message for being late, I put the phone there, so don't wait up for me. He twisted into knots and went down my tummy. Was unlikely to return home anytime soon. Dad's Matt asked him why he wasn't coming home. Voice lower now, as if he knew already. I shook my head in response. No, I responded that I was running late, attempting to sound informal, but the phrases had a weighty, burdensome feel. Given greater significance than they ought to. Matt nodded slowly without blinking. Interaction, the space felt once more cramped. The air is too dense with all of our standing, Matt said. Weren't saying well. Up and approaching me, I suppose that indicates that the house is all ours. For a while, huh? I abruptly swallowed hard. Feeling acutely conscious of the separation or absence of it between us, he stood to shut his eyes and look into my I didn't want to give it, but I suppose so. Speaking just a little bit above a whisper, a pause occurred, a beat of... There was a dense silence that I could almost feel, putting pressure on me, and then before I could. If Matt had anything further to say, he stretched out and grabbed my hand, and I froze. The contact was harmless enough, yet his thumbs gently touched my flesh, sending I had a chill down my back as my breath caught in my throat while I gazed up at him, must maintain my composure while attempting to ignore. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Mom?" he whispered quietly, his voice full of anything I needed to label but couldn't talk to you. I withdrew my hand. My heart is thumping rapidly in my ears. "We can't, Matt." I tried, but I couldn't complete the statement, using the words that felt like too weighty to say aloud. He's hazardous. Stepped forward, his gaze never... "Please leave me, Mum," he muttered. "Listen to me. I'm not sure what's occurring between us, but I understand how you feel." I also took a mental step back, screaming for me to move away between us, but I felt like I was frozen in my heartbeat. Accelerated the weight of, as his words sank in, he was correct. Could sense that odd, unsaid feeling as well. The tension between us had been increasing for weeks, yet I was unable to let it go. "We can't do this any further, Matt," I remarked. Speech quivering. "This isn't correct. You're Matt, my son." Softened his expression, and I just caught a glimpse of the boy he once was. Previously, the boy would rush to me when who would ask the child who scraped his knee? Before going to bed, I had 100 questions. However, that boy was gone, and I now recognized the man standing in front of me. Silently, he muttered, "But I can't help how I don't think you can feel it either." Between us, the air was highly electrified, with a tension we were both unaware of. How to deal with my pulse becoming palpable. My heart is thumping against my chest while I looked for some signs of indication that it was only a miscommunication, but there was no. I shuddered because I mistook the expression in his eyes. My heat is avoiding him once more. "This isn't right, Matt. I'm your I love you mother, but not in that way." Not the manner in which you believe he looked at his face flashed with pain, but I didn't back down because I didn't want to lose. He spoke quietly, his voice full with a silent pleading. "You won't. I promised." I hardly raised my voice above a whisper to him. "But before it becomes worse, we must put an end to this." The hush that ensued was excessive, oppressively heavy with the weight of I wanted to say everything we weren't saying. Soothe him in the same manner that I used to his younger years, but I was unable to not right now, not after all that had, as previously said, I believe we need. Finally, in a weak voice, I replied, "Some space. Perhaps you ought to return to school." "Matt, it's early simply for a short while." Didn't initially say anything, he simply stared at me with an unreadable face. Then, what seemed like an age later, he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said in a whisper. Indeed, the following morning, the house was so silent that I had hardly slept. Repeating all night while tossing and turning the evening's happenings repeatedly, I was unable to make sense of it in my head. How swiftly everything had gotten out of control into a location I never imagined we would be. After I eventually got out of bed, I discovered Matt is seated at the kitchen table. Gazing intently into his coffee cup, he was sitting near the door with his things packed. I said softly, "My heart sank this morning." I was attempting to sound normal, but I wasn't. I'm not even sure I understood what normal felt like. Nevertheless, Mom Matt responded to his. He didn't look up and spoke in a quiet, distant voice. The distance between us seemed more substantial than I stood there for a while as it had always been. I'm not sure what to say at the moment. Felt off because there was a lot of air between us. With the unsaid and unanswered words feelings that had accumulated throughout time, I wanted to let him know a few days ago that it would be all right if we could return to the previous state of affairs, although I knew in my heart that was impossible. Today, I'm returning to school. After a long silence, Matt eventually remarked. His eyes met mine, and they were full with a melancholy I hadn't noticed in him. I nodded previously, and it broke my heart. Carefully attempting to maintain my calm, I think it's best that I stated my. He rose up, his voice scarcely audible above a whisper. Heading to his luggage, but before he could go, he looked back at me. He started to hesitate, as if looking for his mother. I apologize for the appropriate words. I never wanted to make you everything. Uncomfortable, I simply followed his voice. Off, and I saw the tension in his eyes. I forcefully swallowed to ward off the tears that threatened to flow. However, I added gently, "It's okay, Matt. I didn't know if it was, but we'll be okay. We just need a little room right now." He didn't look, but he nodded. Believed there was a protracted, excruciating waiting for him to eventually pick up his bags and made my way to the door. Watched him leave with a heavy feeling of loss, like if something were missing between us, had suffered irreversible damage. Just as he was ready to depart, he made a quick U-turn. He said, "Last time I love you, Mom." Sweet voice that was aching. "Sincerely, Matt, I also adore you," I said. Every time I speak, my voice trembles. The house felt as though he had left. Less full than it had been for years, and I stood there in utter silence for looking at the door for a long time, while attempting in order to interpret everything that had occurred. Yet despite my best efforts, I couldn't get rid of the sensation that something had changed between us. I spent money on something we could never reverse. The remainder of the day attempting to maintain, I'm occupied with cleaning the house, arranging closets or anything else that could divert myself from the idea whirling around in my mind. But the quiet didn't work. There were always the worst moments when I ceased. My thoughts would return to when Matt was in the kitchen. That moment reached out at the point when everything, having finally moved that evening, my husband, he gave me a cheek kiss when he got home, inquiring about my day before settling on the couch as if there were no problems. Not aware of the storm that had occurred, anything simmering beneath the surface that I wanted to urge him to come clean, but I was unable to get myself to complete the weight of what nearly occurred was too hefty, too embarrassed to say aloud. Instead, I left him and went to bed early. I lay in bed downstairs watching TV. The past few days have been dark. I tried playing it repeatedly in my head to persuade myself that everything had been. I'm thinking that the conflict between Matt and I had just recently been the result of thinking too much, but I knew that wasn't the case. A change had occurred, and there was no reversing. The relationship between mother and son had become hazy, and despite the fact that we hadn't crossed it, just because it had visited at all was sufficient to days became weeks, and life began to torment me. Continued, but the house felt, my spouse observed that it was empty without Matt. Naturally, but I always dismissed it, claiming that was simply the progression of children's development and life changes. But I knew in my heart that there was more. Afterward, I attempted to contact Matta, sending him a few texts to check on him doing, but his responses were consistently brief. I knew we were both distant, so I didn't push him. Required time, so as the weeks went by, I maintained wishing the room would facilitate that. The separation would provide us both with the we needed clarity to get past this, but in all honesty, I wasn't certain if we ever could. A mother-child connection and son was meant to be straightforward and pure. However, ours had evolved into something far more complicated, anything that neither of us had expected, and to the extent that I desired to think that we may return to the original stuff, that I secretly knew the change in our relationship had affected both of us forever. And I'm grateful for don't watch and listen to my story. Don't forget to subscribe for